Hi, and welcome to our latest New Scientist Book Club interview. I am here with Annie Jacobsen, author of our latest read, which is Nuclear War, a Scenario, in which Annie imagines minute by minute what would happen in the event of a nuclear strike on the US. Annie, I am a big horror fan, but I think this is the scariest book I have ever read. I thought it was amazing. We've only read science fiction so far in our book club, so this was a bit of a change for all of us, and I'm not sure about finishing it and then immediately waking up the next morning to read about Israel and Iran. That was kind of even more terrifying. But welcome to the book club.
Wow, thank you so much for having me.
I wanted to start by asking you why this topic. I know you've written about military issues before in your books, but what set you off down
Mhm.
this road in particular?
So, as you know, I'm the author of previously, before I wrote Nuclear War, a Scenario, I'd written 6 books on the military and intelligence. So, everything from CIA, DARPA, Area 51, Nazi scientists, all of these different military programs during and since World War II. Imagine all of those sources, approximately 100 per book, and then think about how many of them said to me, with kind of a deep pride, okay, Annie, all of my work was dedicated to preventing nuclear World War III. And so during the previous administration, when we had President Trump in office and there was the fire and fury rhetoric around North Korea, nuclear rhetoric that I myself was hearing for the first time that I could remember, um, I began to wonder, like so many Americans and perhaps people around the world, my God, what if deterrence failed? What if someone lodged a nuclear missile at the United States of America? And I put that question to the highest level national security people I had been working with in the US. And the result is the book.
One of the reasons the book is so powerful is that you don't just explain to us in detail what the devastation of a nuclear bomb would be, but you imagine in minute by minute detail how it would all play out. How did you come up with this approach?
Well, that was part of the process, which is kind of one of the joys of being an investigative reporter is that you don't know what you don't know until you begin to learn it, right? And then, so I think that thematically you can start with an idea, what if deterrence failed? But how do you report that book begins to reveal itself as you start to talk to sources. And so, for example, I myself did not know that the Cerberus satellite space system that the Defense Department runs, parked in geosync over these 9 nuclear armed nations, can detect ballistic missile launch in under one fraction of a second. I didn't know that. And yet I'm a national security reporter. So, dare I say, most people didn't know that, perhaps before reading the book. And once you learn that, you have your first moment. You go, okay, well, wait a minute, and then you can ask a question. If that is known, then surely it is known what happens in second 2 and second 3, and that's where the ticking clock scenario became immediately the obvious way to go.
And once you were writing, how willing did you find people were to talk to you? Tell us about kind of the research and the interviews, how you went down tracking down information.
Well, that's always part and parcel of being an investigative journalist. I write long form, so I write very long books, usually longer than this book. Book is shorter because, unfortunately, nuclear war unfolds really fast, as readers learn. But it is part of the process to, at least my process, to spend time with sources, to ask them questions, to go back and ask them more questions. I'm not the reporter who does a 3.5 minute interview with someone. I just feel that puts both them and my own self on the spot. I mean, okay, maybe with exception, if someone only had 3.5 minutes for me, I would surely take that rather than nothing. But that would be late in the game of the interviewing process where I had to ask them a confirming question. Mostly it's about working with people and getting a sense of what it is that they feel is, you know, most impactful in their career, and then trying to work on those details.
Were you surprised at how willing people were to talk to you about some of this, how open they were? Because some of these details are just extraordinary that we learn about.
Yes and no. And, it's not my first rodeo. I have written a lot of books and I work very diligently to maintain the middle of the road approach. In other words, I don't bring politics into any of my books. You have no idea how I vote. And in the United States, journalism has become entwined with politics in a way that I think the public. It doesn't serve the public, in my opinion, because the public needs to know the facts. No one should be for nuclear war, for example. And so this is a long-winded way of answering your question that I have a lot of sources in the military. I also have sources in the disarmament world. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. And so am I surprised that people talk to me? No, because I always present myself as the journalist who is interested in presenting that individual side of the story.
I personally knew very little about the history of all of this, and I was shocked learning about the plan for general nuclear war that the US signed off on in 1960, the one that would kill 600 million people. I mean, that was the first shocking thing first thing to shock me. But there was a lot else. Was there something in particular that surprised you, that shocked you the most as you were writing?
I mean, this was one of those books that everything shocked me. And again, I cannot reiterate enough. I know a lot in this area. I have studied historically a lot of these programs. And yet to really stop and think about what would happen in the seconds and minutes of nuclear war shocked me at every turn. From the dangerous policies that are in place, like launch on warning and sole presidential authority, to the incredible technology that we just spoke of, the Cerberus satellites, for example, but then also the fact that the dangerous holes in technology, both in our own and also in America's adversaries, that could ultimately lead to this sort of, conflict based on misunderstanding.
Yes, tell us a bit more about that, because in the book you imagine what happens when Russia makes a mistake about the US's intentions. Tell us about that hole in technology.
It was Hans Christensen, who is this incredible journalist, or he's not a journalist, he's actually a historian of nuclear weapons here in the United States. And he works with the Federation of American Scientists, and he keeps track of all the nuclear warheads as best as can be kept track of. He and his team, he has a lot of help. But he was the one who initially told me that the US ICBM does not have enough range to travel directly to North Korea, but rather has to travel over Russia. And when you're thinking about this unfolding in real time, and you can't get the president of Russia on the phone, imagine what could go wrong. And that kind of a detail, you think, is that, okay, Hans Christensen, incredibly reliable source, but I better fact check that with a former Secretary of Defense, which I did. And so in my interview with Leon Panetta, and he confirmed with me, not only is that a fact, but it's one that troubles him and troubled his colleagues. And then adding to that a line like, and of course the actual line is in the book, I'm paraphrasing, I don't think people really think about those things when nuclear war is unfolding, is enough to take your breath away.
Absolutely. So we learn a lot about the terrifying technologies that are out there, but I was also really fascinated to learn about some of the people at the heart of some of these stories. I found John Rubel a really interesting character, and his late in life decision to talk about what happened back in the 1960s, and how he felt about what was going on in that room when America made its plans for general nuclear war. I saw him kind of reflected in your fictional Secretary of Defense there, who wonders if actually maybe we shouldn't launch at Russia, even though they launched at us.
Absolutely. And that hypothetical Secretary of Defense was also based on my lengthy interviews with former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, now in his 90s, who reflected with me in our discussions about what, he put himself in those shoes, which is how I sort of source some of the material. And if readers go into the footnotes while they're reading, you can sometimes see, aha, that interview with that person led to that sort of premise. And it was Bill Perry who, my takeaway of our interviews was, here he's a man who dedicated most of his life, the majority of his career, to the sort of military industrial complex. I mean, and it is sometimes seen as a pejorative word, but it's actually a factual word. There is a military, there is industry, and they work together to create these weapon systems. And then you have Bill Perry, the human. And that is always what I'm after in my journalism, the human. That is what I look for in sources, right? And here you have a man who's a grandfather and who is saying, very much like Rubel, although I never met Rubel personally, that's from his memoir. But that similarity, the humanness of being an older person about to die, right? We all die, and saying to themselves, where did I err? Where might I have done things differently? And to me, the takeaway of that for readers and for my own self, not just as a journalist, but as a mother, is, what can I do better?
Your hypothetical Secretary of Defense suddenly stops seeing it as a war against a different nation, but as the kind of, he realizes it's the end of civilization, and he thinks about things in that way, as opposed to the kind of militaristic approach. I thought that was really interesting. But I also, you don't dwell too much, I think, because there's not enough time to do so in these minutes as they pass in your hypothetical scenario on how these people are feeling. They're having to make their decisions without getting into the feelings, because they don't have time for it. And it's extraordinary that when it comes down to it, the president has this 6-minute window, as you put it, to decide whether or not to retaliate against the nuclear strike.
It's shocking. These are not these existential issues. Should I end civilization or not? Do not take place on a mountaintop or a long walk on a beach or even an incredible roundtable session in a bunker. They happen, as you said, in a 6-minute window. And this is astonishing. And another thing that comes to mind when I hear you say, how it all ends in nuclear Armageddon, nuclear Holocaust. These were quotes I pulled from world leaders. That is what is astonishing to me, when you can see on the record presidents of the United States, the UN Secretary General, people that are very high up in the nuclear command and control system and highly cleared, understand how this ends. And that is enough to make anybody hopefully read the book and say, what can I do better?
Yeah, absolutely. You have your quotes from Craig Fugate, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, who basically admits that if this happens, it's everyone for themselves. There's not really anything the government can do at all.
And what a stunning interview that was, that I am extremely grateful for, his candor. And, to say on the record that after a nuclear strike, there would be no population protection planning because everyone would be dead, coming from Obama's FEMA director, is startling. And I even went back to him and said, I just really want to double and triple check that this is your statement. I mean,
Yeah.
my God, that's not something you would want to get wrong. And he absolutely stood by it. And, even wrote an Amazon review, which is like, again, I think what this speaks to me, which is what's important about all of this, is that we are all just humans at the end of the day. And when you retire from these positions of extreme power in the United States government, I believe that you put your human hat on. And we live in a very dangerous time. And so the fact that some of these high ranking individuals formerly would go on the record like this, I think is very heartening.
Well, it's like John Rubel, I guess, coming back to look at it again. It's the difference that they can make later in the game. Tell us a bit about your doomsday scenario and the high altitude EMP strike.
Electric Armageddon. You know, that was a very interesting element of the book to report because it has been it's not unknown here in the United States. Now, it's certainly not known to the average Joe or Jane, but among the national security analysts, the EMP, the electric Armageddon, this idea that you could detonate a warhead, a small nuclear warhead, 300 miles over the central part of the United States and essentially take out the entire grid, electric grid. This has been debated since since 9/11, since the terrorist attacks, because it was seen as a possible terrorist move. And what happened was it became completely politicized. You had one side saying, what they were saying, and the other side adamantly opposed to it. And so in reporting that part of the book, I had to really work hard to find sources that would speak to me candidly and objectively and not take their the arguments they had already laid down into the book. And so for that, I went to, two experts, Richard Garwin, who wrote the original paper on EMP, and also General Toohill, who was America's first cyber chief. And so from them, you learn that this is absolutely a potential reality. And I think, again, it speaks to let's make sure this doesn't happen.
Absolutely. How scared are you, Annie, that this could come to pass? Does it keep you up at night?
I always believe in the optimistic idea of change. I just really do. So, in the big picture, people often say to me, like, did you get incredibly depressed writing this book? It was actually more devastating to write the book I wrote previously called First Platoon, which was about a group of young soldiers who fought in Afghanistan. And that really was upsetting to me because it happened. And the young people who fight America's wars are often deeply impacted and not in a great way. And that's very troubling. This, on the other hand, is a hypothetical scenario that has not happened. And the point of the book underlying all of it is that change is possible. In my interviews, I cite the Reagan reversal, which is that in 1983, there was a mini series on television here. It was called The Day After. I know you guys had Threads a little bit later, right? And so this was a horrific account of a fictional nuclear war between the United States and Soviet Russia. And 100 million Americans watched it, including one very important American, President Ronald Reagan. Before that, he was a supreme hawk. He was for nuclear weapons. The more, the better. That was his position. And after seeing that miniseries, he wrote in his presidential journal that he became greatly depressed. Those are his words. Then he reached out to Gorbachev, and the result was the Reykjavik summit. And because of that, the world has gone from 70,000 nuclear warheads, which was the all-time high in 1986, to the approximate 12,500 nuclear warheads that exist now. That's progress. That's hope. That's change.
And hopefully your book can make a difference for that too, showing those of us who didn't know very much about it at all how horrific it would actually be.
And we seem to have forgotten that from all those years ago. And so if there's any contribution I can make as a storyteller, it's bringing the story back into the front and center of people's minds, because the UN Secretary General himself said recently that we're all just one misunderstanding or one miscalculation away from nuclear Armageddon.
There's a line that haunts me that you repeat throughout the book, the après moi le déluge line, the idea of the mad king who just takes matters into his own hands and let what come after may. It's definitely a very haunting thought.
That's absolutely right. And that idea was reminded to me by Richard Garwin. And maybe your listeners don't know Garwin as much as we might here in the United States, but he was the architect of the first thermonuclear bomb. So in other words, people think of Edward Teller as the father of the thermonuclear bomb. But Teller could only theoretically conceive it. He couldn't actually draw the plans to make the bomb explode. And that was done by Richard Garwin, who was 23, 24 years old back in 1952 when this was going on. And now in his 90s, Garwin did multiple interviews with me. And as we began in the beginning of our discussion here, like, I spent hours asking Garwin, what do you think about this? What, like, all these different concepts I wanted to know from his brain, from his experience. He's advised every president of the United States since Eisenhower. He was a founding member of the NRO, itself an agency that was classified for 30 years. And he's the one who said to me what he worried most about was, the Mad King idea, that you could have someone who felt exactly like that quote you said, après moi le déluge, after me the flood. Like, it doesn't matter what happens after I die. That is a terrifying thought if that individual has their hands on a nuclear arsenal.
How did he feel about what he did, Richard Garwin? Then, what are his thoughts on having been the architect of this weapon?
And I asked him that exact question, and he said, I asked him if he wished he had never designed it. And he took a long pause and he said, I wished it couldn't have been designed.
In that someone would have done it if it hadn't been him.
Who
knows, I guess.
The subtext of that answer to me is so profound, and also the mystery of it, right? So that was like a real decision to not, a conscious journalist decision to not ask a follow-up question, because I wanted it to linger in the air, right? Because it does have a point, if you are a brilliant scientist and you are capable of doing that kind of math, should you? I can't answer that because I'm not a brilliant scientist. That's for someone like Richard Garwin to answer.
Yeah, interesting. I've got one last question from me, and then I'm going to come on to a few questions from our readers. So you write in the book, after nuclear war, who, if anyone, will know that we were once here? Do you conclude after all of your research that any of humanity could be left? Like, could we have some people lingering on in Australia and New Zealand? If so, should we all move to New Zealand?
Well, so for the part of the book that's called, that's about nuclear winter, I interviewed Professor Brian Toon, the brilliant scientist who has spent decades working on the nuclear winter theory after he was one of the original 5 authors of the nuclear winter theory in 1983 with Carl Sagan, who was his professor. And Toon took me through shared with me his PowerPoint slides that he uses to teach his students about all of this. And the climate modeling that has come to fruition since those days due to all the computers that we have now that can do this kind of thing, demonstrating how many people would die, that actually nuclear winter is worse than was imagined in 1983. And yes, Toon explained to me that there would possibly be some agriculture that would survive, ability to perform, to do agriculture in those countries, in Australia and New Zealand. But the rest of the world, the mid-latitudes, for example, which is the breadbasket of the earth. So from Iowa to Ukraine, for example, these areas would be, the large bodies of water between them would be frozen over in sheets of ice. And you would have, agriculture would fail. And with the failure of agriculture comes the death of 5 billion people. And so then you have to ask yourself, to your question, okay, so the people that are left living in Australia and New Zealand, and now they're hunter-gatherers, quasi-agriculturalists, that's that Nikita Khrushchev quote that comes to mind. The survivors would envy the dead.
Yeah. It's a cheery note to end there. I'll move on to a few reader questions. Thomas asks, why did you choose the first strike to be an ICBM rather than the EMP bomb? Because if that was so powerful, it could have knocked down the entire power grid, and then it would have disabled the chance for the victim country to retaliate.
Exactly. But I wanted to choose the ICBM strike because I wanted readers to understand how nuclear war unfolds in seconds and minutes based on the technology, the weapon systems that America has spent trillions of dollars putting into play since, in over the past decades. Because I think those are really, really important to understand that it's not just nuclear stockpiling. It's also defense stockpiling, if you will. And that promotes this idea that, well, if the United States has it, we need it. And that furthers along this idea of the military industrial complex and
Mm-hmm.
nuclear weapons. And, America created this problem, let's be frank. And I do think America, and when I say that, I mean the president of the United States has the power to lead the charge in turning all of this around.
Do you think they will?
I would hope. I mean, right. So, in other words, to answer your reader's question, if you just let off the EMP, then all the blame goes elsewhere. Right. Versus sometimes as a journalist, or as a storyteller, you are telling the story that you believe has the most impact.
I guess that will be a similar answer to the next question, which comes from Phil then. Why do you choose North Korea as the nation that started the nuclear exchange rather than Russia, for example?
Even though the premise of the book is in nuclear war, there are no rules, okay? There actually are some guidelines. And one of the very important guidelines is reporting to other countries your ICBM launch tests. This is very important. During the Ukraine war, America suspended an ICBM test, and so did Russia, for exactly the reason that no one wants to start a nuclear war by accident. I myself did not know. Again, a national security reporter, before I began reporting this book, I did not know that North Korea is the only nation that regularly launches missiles, including ballistic missiles, not telling anyone. Okay. And so the fact that there have been 100 of these launches since 2002, when you think of what goes on in the bunkers, the nuclear command and control bunkers, those first 150 seconds after the launch, and believe me, I interviewed the people involved, they are absolutely focused on, is this an ICBM coming toward the United States of America? I mean, that is it's just preposterously dangerous. And so the reason I chose North Korea is because North Korea is the ultimate rogue nation acting with rogue behavior. And if perhaps one idea is that if the other nuclear armed nations are all playing by the rules, why isn't North Korea?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes absolute sense. And Julie says, how were you able to live closely with such horrifying material for so long? I guess you kind of answered that in that it's a scenario, right?
To this I'll add, so there's a book called The Effects of Nuclear Weapons, which a lot of the specific details of, what gets knocked over where and at what speed, and a lot of the sort of horror all comes from these Defense Department manuals. And one of the things that I found more upsetting than the actual reporting was the reality that in this 650-page document, actually pull it out and show it to you. In this 650-page document, right? So here it is, and that's how thick it is. And
Wow.
only on page 542 do they say biological effects on humans. So what nuclear weapons do to humans is kind of an afterthought. And that's what I found far more disturbing than the actual reality of, third degree burns and whatnot,
Mm.
limbs getting ripped off by wind, is that scientists in the Defense Department could be so singularly focused on destroying other nations' property that they forgot about the people,
Mm. Yeah,
or the people were kind of an afterthought.
yeah, yeah. And I'm going to finish just with a comment from Kim, who wanted me to pass on my thanks for such an intelligently written book, which she says is full of the facts in a way that's understandable to a normal person, but in no way diminishing the importance of the message. Which I think is absolutely how I feel too. You say in your acknowledgements that the fundamental idea behind the book is to demonstrate in appalling detail just how horrifying a nuclear war would be, and it absolutely does that. So thank you so much for coming to talk to us, and I hope everyone reads this book. I feel like it's such an important one.
Thank you so much for having me, and for all the readers reading the book.